Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
And I'm Rabbi Kahn, and we have a very interesting episode today. In many ways, this episode is a follow-up to a lot of our episodes. Talli, why don't you present it?
Well, I hope it will be interesting to our listeners. We're going to talk about the concept of sexual health. What is sexual health, and what is sex positivity? And what are the universal sexual health principles and rights? I kind of brought them up because I wanted to present them to you and hear your take about how they conflict, possibly, or how they merge with Jewish values.
I can say off the top that some conflict and some don't. Some are right in line with Jewish values and some are very much not. We'll see that as we get into the episode today. We'll get to all of that shortly. First, remember to check out our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikveh list, and more. Intimate Judaism has been the starting point for a lot of important discussions about sex and intimacy, how they relate to Torah Judaism. Without giving too much away, Talli, I know that one issue we're going to discuss today is honesty in conversations about sex. And this podcast, I believe, plays an important role in that endeavor. So listeners, please help us to continue to have these honest conversations by sharing this podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or any other way you can get the word out.
I also want to send a shout out to all of our listeners who have sent us messages through email and Facebook messages and Instagram messages. We're getting a lot of great ideas and a lot of great feedback, and we do really listen to your messages. We don't often read them out loud on the show, but we still really, really appreciate it, and we do use your suggestions. I think that today's podcast is really somewhat of an outcome of the different requests that we've gotten to please talk about the messages that we send our kids around sexuality. One letter that you recently got where the person who wrote about how surprised he was to hear what young yeshivish boys think about sex, that it's supposed to be just for reproduction, and that, you get permission to have sex because of reproduction. And that was kind of very surprising to the listener who wrote in.
So please, with that in mind, continue to send us your questions and comments to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Make sure to visit jewishcoffeehouse.com as well as tallirosenbaum.com. And Talli, you're also presenting a webinar, aren't you?
I'm going to be presenting a webinar on the treatment of sex addiction / out of control or problematic sexual behavior. And I think this relates very much to what we're going to be talking about today. We're not going to be specifically talking about addictions or problematic sexual behavior, but we are going to be talking about the idea of conflict, the idea of when your sexual desires, drives, needs, or the way you're wired sexually may be in conflict with your values, and what can happen as a result, and how to navigate the conflict and how to integrate yourself with your sexual needs and wants versus the conflicts that you might have with your values and with law, with Jewish law. I won't be specifically giving this talk to a Jewish audience. It's going to be for a wider audience, but I will be talking specifically about values and religious values. Even today, Scott, when I said that I would like to introduce the notion of sexual health, what the definition is of sexual health, and what the 6 sexual health principles are, you said, well, I've already looked at them, and some of them align with Jewish messages, but some of them out and out conflict. So I think that right off the bat, we need to be aware that conflict is a part of life, and we will probably be discussing that today.
Absolutely. I guess that's a good entryway into our topic. The World Health Organization has issued a definition of sexual health. I'd like to ask you, Talli, what is the definition of sexual health, and how is the idea of pleasure viewed by the World Health Organization and other health professionals?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that if you look back to the messages that were given around sexuality in the past, if you look at sexual health curricula and you look at the messages of sex educators, sex therapists, in the past, a lot of the discussion around sex was kind of negative. Have sex, but be careful. Be careful not to do anything dangerous. Be careful not to do anything that could give you a disease or cause a pregnancy. But there wasn't necessarily a rights-based message around the fundamental right to engage in sex, obviously only under certain circumstances, consensually, for example. And the idea of pleasure was not necessarily one that was brought in to the original sexual health definition. Also, I think I should state that we know about health. We know about general health. We look at general health not only as an absence of disease or pathology. We look at it as wellness, fitness. And this is how we want to relate as well to sexual health. So the World Health Organization looks at 4 aspects of health: physical health, mental health, spiritual health, which I think is very important because in this case, spiritual health and the 4th health, which is sexual health, could possibly conflict.
Right.
Not necessarily even the values, but also your mental health can be affected by a conflict between your spirituality and your sexuality. So that's something that we want to keep in mind.
So all 4 of these types of health that you just defined are completely interlocked in so many ways.
They are interlocked. In fact, when we look at the definitions of problematic sexual behavior, and we have a whole podcast that we talked about sex addiction, and sex addiction does not appear in the DSM, which is the mental health cataloging of mental health disorders, but in the ICD-9, which is more of the medical cataloging, the international classification system, there does exist a classification called compulsive sexual behavior. And compulsive sexual behavior falls under not addictions, but more impulsive or compulsive behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
And
under the larger rubric of something like OCD?
That could be one of the manifestations. But one thing that does not get included as a criterion for compulsive sexual behavior is if there are mental health issues associated with the distress around the behavior because of religion. So if you masturbate once a day and you're very distressed about it because you're religious and you don't want to masturbate, and so you have emotional distress as a result, it still doesn't count as compulsive sexual behavior. So that's kind of something to keep in mind as we look at different ways of defining problems. But I don't want to talk about problems. I want to talk about what is sexual health, like the question that you asked me. So I'll read you the definition.
Please.
Sexual health is fundamental to overall health and well-being of individuals, couples, and families, and to the social and economic development of communities and countries. Sexual health, when viewed affirmatively, requires a positive and respectful approach to sexuality and sexual relationships, as well as the possibility of having pleasurable and safe sexual experiences, free of coercion, discrimination, or violence. Now, to do that, several components need to be in place. There needs to be access to comprehensive, good quality information, sex education. That's kind of like a right. Knowledge about the risks that can be faced with certain sexual activities. So knowing about the consequences of unprotected sex, for example. Having access to sexual health care. That's a very important right. Living in an environment that affirms and promotes sexual health. Knowing how to protect yourself, against unintended pregnancy, sexual dysfunction, being able to access treatment for sexual dysfunction, being able to protect yourself from sexual violence or harmful practices such as female genital mutilation. These are all listed under the sexual health definition.
Not that I'm disagreeing with it, but it sounds more like rights that every person should have.
These are sexual rights. Exactly. They're actually listed as sexual rights.
Okay.
The World Health Organization also came out, I believe it was in 2019, with a statement on sexual pleasure. And their statement is as follows. Sexual pleasure is the physical and or psychological satisfaction and enjoyment derived from shared or solitary erotic experiences, including thoughts, fantasies, dreams, emotions, and feelings. Self-determination, consent, safety, privacy, confidence, and the ability to communicate and negotiate sexual relations are key enabling factors for pleasure to contribute to sexual health and well-being. Sexual pleasure should be exercised within the context of sexual rights, particularly the rights to equality and non-discrimination, autonomy and bodily integrity, the right to the highest attainable standard of health and freedom of expression. The experiences of human sexual pleasure are diverse, and sexual rights ensure that pleasure is a positive experience for all concerned and not obtained by violating other people's human rights and well-being. And then there is a list of several statements. Sexual pleasure is a fundamental part of sexual rights. Sexual pleasure includes the possibility of diverse experience. Kind of lists what was sort of already said.
Can you please enlighten me, because obviously this is your field, not mine. Is this the same thing as what they call sex positivity? Is it the same thing, or is it something different?
I would say that it's similar. In other words, the message is a sex positive message, but sex positivity is more of a movement than it is an actual defined set of principles. And
what is that movement?
I would say that sex positivity is an attitude towards human sexuality, which regards all sexual activities, as long as they're consensual, to be fundamentally healthy. Fundamentally, as long as they're pleasurable, they should be encouraged. Experimentation should be encouraged. Obviously, there's advocacy for comprehensive sex education and safe sex as part of the sex positivity campaign. People ask a lot, is Judaism sex positive, or are you a sex positive therapist? And I really don't necessarily know what sex positive means in terms of objective criteria, because when we look at the sexual health principles, we do appreciate that you're allowed to have your values. I think we cannot separate values from any sort of sex education or sexual experimentation or sexual discourse, because people do have values around sex. The sex positivity movement in and of itself,
it sounds like it's value free per se. Like that's almost the definition of it.
The movement doesn't make moral distinctions amongst sexual activities, and that's very different from our culture.
It sounds like it says something like, if it's consensual and safe and pleasurable, then you should do it.
Yes.
I don't know if I'll get in trouble for asking this. Does that even apply to things like incest? Or how far does this go?
No, it doesn't, because it doesn't apply to anything that is against the law, and incest is against the law in most places that I know about. So what this might allow for is the removal of different paraphilias from being considered to be pathological, as long as they are consensual and you're not hurting anybody. So if you are a peeping Tom, for example, a voyeur, and you are exploiting somebody who's being watched, obviously that's against the law. If you are going to exploit a child, or if you are going to do something that is against the law, then you are liable for being prosecuted according to whatever the criminal laws are. So it's not completely values free, because there is an understanding that we need to be law-abiding citizens, but they are free of moral judgment. So if you say, I'm into kink, I like BDSM, I like doing this or doing that, or I like having sex with men and with women, or I like having non-monogamous sex, or I like having chemsex, or I like having cyber sex, whatever those things are, they're not going to come and say, that's wrong, that's immoral, that's too much. Those are judgments that are reserved for our moral side, our ethical side, our values-based side. And you can have them, and that's okay. But nobody's going to come and say it's sexually unhealthy. It's only sexually unhealthy if it hurts somebody else.
Okay, so let's say a husband has an affair, and he doesn't tell his wife about it. And I'm not trying to get into moral values right now, but he's not hurting his wife because she doesn't know about it. On the other hand, he's having a consensual relationship with the other woman.
It falls under exploitation, though, and it falls under a breach of honesty. It's not considered to be sexually ethical, because you don't have a non-monogamy contract. However,
see.
sexual health would say if you have a non-monogamy contract, then, sleep with all the other people that you want as long as, so there are
So now I
values.
understand better.
There are values, but those values are, according to the principles. And the short version, like the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch of the sexual health umbrella, is the principles, the 6 principles of sexual health as were defined and edited, so to speak, by Douglas Braun Harvey. He, together with Michael Vigorito, have a book that's called Rethinking Sexual Addiction. But he is also known for devising these 6 principles based on the fundamentals of the sexual health definition. And amongst those principles are honesty and non-exploitation.
Okay, in that case, let's go through these 6 principles, because obviously speaking about what you just described as sex positivity per se, I don't think people would argue that that's a totally Jewish idea, simply because Judaism is about having boundaries and having very specific values beyond what the law says, perhaps beyond these 6 principles, as we'll see shortly. Before we get into the 6 principles, sex positivity per se as an absolute certainly doesn't jive exactly with Judaism. I think that's a fair statement, but let's look at each one of these statements, each one of these principles, because some do and some don't.
Right. And look, I think that when we talk about Judaism being sex positive, I think that what people want to know is if Judaism fundamentally views sex as a positive act and as a positive part of your being. Do we value sexual health the same way that we value physical health? Unishmartem od l'nafshatechem. We do value physical and emotional health. We definitely value spiritual health. So do we also value our sexual development and our sexual health? And can that be considered a Jewish value to nurture your sexuality, to nurture pleasure? I think that might be a stretch. And I think it also there's not a one answer. I think it also very much depends on the different streams
Absolutely.
of Jewish thought.
Judaism is multivocal, as we've said many times, and there's no one Judaism says anything about. There are a few things, but generally there are a lot of different voices. The real question is, where is the weight of Jewish thought often? Because you can usually find someone who will disagree. At the same time, the way you just described sex positivity in a Jewish context is obviously much more narrow than sex positivity as a movement, because in the Jewish context, there are certainly opinions that say, I would think it's the majority opinion, that sex is a positive thing. It's an important part of a marital relationship within defined boundaries, such as during marriage. Sex is a very good thing, and one should cultivate this relationship, and a sexual relationship being a good thing is a part of that marriage and a part of that relationship. But that's very different from saying, we're basically values free here, do whatever feels good. Obviously, there's a huge gap between those two ideas.
Right. I think that the place of values is mentioned. It's mentioned as shared values. In other words, if you choose a sexual partner, there needs to be mutuality and honesty and discussion about what each other's values are. Mm-hmm. And there needs to be negotiation around sexual activity. So there's a value to the idea of values and shared values. They may not be distinctly Jewish or distinctly halachic according to Jewish law, but there is a place for ethics and values within sexuality as we understand sexual health in the world at large. That's really important to put out there, because I think that there is a sense that the world at large has no values around sexuality and anything goes. And I don't think that that's necessarily the case.
Okay. So in that case, let's go through the principles which really define what we're talking about. How about, Talli, you explain each of the principles in turn, and then I'll try to give my opinion as to whether that is generally speaking in line with Torah values, with Jewish values as I see it.
Okay, so the first principle would be consent. Sexual health requires sex to be consensual. It's a basic universal sexual health principle, and it means that I am voluntarily wanting, cooperating, agreeing to have sex with you. I do want to point out that in today's discussion around sexuality, the idea of consent is not considered to be enough. And
what do you mean by that?
Okay, so I just had this conversation with Douglas Braun Harvey. Right before the podcast, I wanted to ask him a few questions just to clarify. And I said, how come your definition of consent doesn't talk about enthusiastic consent? What he said to me was that the world doesn't even know enough about consent. And these are fundamental basic principles. Let's get the fundamental basic principles out there and just make sure that everybody in the world is having sex consensually, which is not something that we can assume at this point in the world. And then we can talk about the narrative of enthusiastic consent.
I think that's fantastic because it actually is very much in line with the way that I think we can approach some of these issues from a Jewish perspective. What I mean is that very often when trying to define what a Jewish value is, it's not so clear, but we can take ideas that are present perhaps in rudimentary or early form in basic halachot and take the idea as it emerges and see, we see this as a value which perhaps the halacha doesn't entirely represent, but which clearly it is beginning to push towards. I'll give you an example, not from the realm of sexuality, but the Torah clearly has an anti-slavery mentality. The whole narrative of Yetziat Mitzrayim, leaving Egypt, is about you were slaves and now you're free. That entire concept is telling us that slavery is a bad thing. One should not be enslaved. At the same time, given the cultural reality when the Torah was given, slavery is permitted in the Torah. If one were to simply look at a halacha in isolation, one could say clearly the Torah is pro-slavery because you're allowed to have slaves. On the other hand, given the story of the Exodus and all of the laws that apply to how one must treat a slave, which the Gemara even says, if you have a slave, it's like you have a master. That means ultimately that while allowing slavery, the idea of being anti-slavery is embedded in that halacha, almost ironically. In some ways, what you just quoted sounds to me almost like the same idea. Let's first get the idea of consent, and then from that, perhaps later on, when history is ripe, we can talk about enthusiastic consent, which is implicit in the idea of consent already. Because
I'd like to believe that history is ripe for the discussion of enthusiastic consent.
Yeah. Oh, I'm just saying what he said, that idea of let's first finish this and then maybe we can move on when we are ready. Exactly. I'm not saying he's right or wrong, we're not ready for it. The reason I wanted to mention it because my general approach to these issues in terms of figuring out the Torah view, so to speak, about something is to look at the idea that's implicit, not necessarily only at the law as it is in black and white. It's much more than that.
Yeah. But I also want to point out that, until very recently, our discussions of sex have been about preparing for marriage. And in those discussions, there has been very little on consent. If you take any marital book, any book about intimacy or sexuality, any kind of teaching curricula for premarital education, there's really very little said about the subject of consent. This is somewhat of a new subject to talk about. People are talking about it more, and thank goodness for that.
I think that the idea of consent, we talked about this in an earlier episode as well, the idea of marital rape, just because she's married to you doesn't mean it's not rape, and that is also implicit and sometimes explicit in the halacha. In fact, we say that a man cannot demand sex from his wife. Ironically, she's allowed to demand sex from him. That's a different question because obviously it's consent in a different direction. How practically that works is another matter. Often whether halacha says something and whether people act that way are two entirely different things. But halacha insists upon consent. Another idea that comes out, we see in the Torah, the prohibition against rape, which to us is self-evident. In the times of the Torah 3,000 years ago, it may not have been nearly as self-evident. And that already is the beginning of the idea of consent, which Chazal and later authorities up to, and certainly including modern authorities, have developed into the idea that consent is absolutely imperative. And I think we can even say enthusiastic consent, as you suggested before.
Yeah, so I think that what we want to be able to do, I'm going to kind of finish up with the idea of consent, but we want to be able to also differentiate the idea of consent from the next principle, which is non-exploitation.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, what is the difference? Because when I was reading through these principles, it seemed to me that non-exploitation is almost a category within consent. If you're exploiting somebody, then you don't have their consent. I don't really understand the difference.
I will explain that. So just going back to consent for a moment, we want to establish consent throughout each step of a sexual interaction. It really helps to prevent an intrusive, invasive, or violating event. Okay, so what's the difference between non-consent and exploitation? I actually discussed this with Douglas Braun Harvey himself.
You're name dropping a lot today.
Yeah. No, he's done a lot of really important work in the field. And he said that exploitation is really the use of power to influence a person to have sex. When you are in a position of power, if there's a power differential, if the person is a boss or the person has some way, if you think about Harvey Weinstein, right? So he never said there was no consent. He said all these women consented. But the fact is that he never said he wasn't exploitative, because he was. When you have a person in a position of influence and power who can use that power either for you or against you, you're not really in a position to be able to be equal to that person. And so that is what can create an exploitative scenario. Exploitation is basically the use of power to influence a person to have sex, and it is a violation. Basically, the person who is an exploiter is not necessarily a person who is going to use non-consent, but often they can. If the exploitation doesn't work for them, then they might go to the next level, which is coercion or force. So you can have exploitation with consent.
I guess what you said before about enthusiastic consent, avoiding exploitation is part of the process of having enthusiastic consent, I suppose. Meaning even if somebody consents but not enthusiastically, that may be a case, for example, of exploitation.
Absolutely, because a person is leveraging his power and his control in order to receive sexual gratification. And if people are under the oppressive influence of exploitation, they might be placing themselves in danger if they say no. Like, they have to prioritize their survival, so they say yes. And I said to him,
can I suggest something even further?
Yeah.
If I can add this, it's not only that they don't want to say yes, but they are nervous about something. It could be they don't have the ability to say no because they're too young, or for whatever psychological reason, they're not empowered to say no. So they think they're consenting, perhaps even enthusiastically, but they're still being exploited. For example, having sex with a minor.
Absolutely. And going back to Judaism and Jewish law, like you said before, that a man cannot make his wife have sex, but a woman can make her husband have sex with him. I think that what we need to recognize is that historically, the man had the power over the woman. He was the one with the power, and she would not have really been able to exploit him. There was a power differential, and in some communities that still exists to some extent. So when the Torah says, if your wife wants to, you should give it to her, it's because she's not in a position to coerce or force. Whereas the other way around, he would have been in a position to do so.
It's redressing a power imbalance.
Yes. Yeah.
In terms of what you're describing of exploitation, to me, the most obvious example of the Torah forbidding exploitation, and I believe it does forbid exploitation, is expressed in the din of what's called the Mefateh, which is in the Shemot Perek Kaf Bet, Psukim, I believe, Tet Vav and Tet Zayin, 22 verses 15 and 16, where one is not allowed to seduce somebody. It means a na'ara, a young girl. And should one seduce her, he either must marry her or provide financial restitution to her father. Later on in the Mishnah, in Masechet Ketuvot, in the fourth parak, it says the restitution also sometimes goes to the daughter herself. Without getting into the details, once again, it's a very, very specific halachic situation, but I think I believe the value of not exploiting is implicit, in some ways explicit, in that specific law of the Mefateh.
How is the value of not exploiting so...
Well, I think here we have a case of someone who's seducing a young girl, and she doesn't really have the ability to say no, perhaps. The fact that she's young,
so
the fact that he's seducing her, this is prohibited.
So
it's exploitation, I think.
Yes, okay.
Exploitation is implicitly not allowed based on the negative view of the Mefateh. This is something he should not and cannot do. Now, Talli, I wouldn't be being honest if I didn't raise an issue to which I alluded earlier, namely the idea of betrothal or marriage of a minor, because the Torah does indeed give a father license and right to marry off his daughter when she's 3 years old or older until she's 12. This sounds like the epitome of exploitation, marrying off a child. So first of all, remember that, of course, in the times of the Torah, we're talking thousands of years ago, child marriage was normal and expected. And because of this, what the Torah is allowing may well be understood as mitigating the negative effects, making sure that a child is taken care of in a very specific way as put forward by the Torah. Nevertheless, obviously, it makes us uncomfortable to look at this halacha. It's important to note that in Masechet Kiddushin, Daf Mem Aleph Amud Aleph, page 41a, in the name of Rav, it is stated that it is forbidden to a father to marry off his daughter until she's old enough that she can make her own decision. What's amazing about this is that the Torah itself says that it is allowed, and Chazal said it is forbidden. I think that tells us an important point about the way we can understand certain laws in the Torah, and this is not the only example. Some laws of the Torah are not saying this is a good thing to do. Rather, they're saying, if you do this, it will work. In other words, if a father marries off his daughter when she's 3, 4, 5 years old, it works. It doesn't make it a good thing to do. In fact, it's a bad thing to do. It's asur, according to Rav, forbidden. Nevertheless, the spiritual laws behind it mean that she is indeed married. This has come up in many situations. In fact, about 30 years ago or so, I remember it was an article in the Journal of Halacha and Contemporary Society. It was journal number 30. There was an article about a very specific and notorious case that took place where a man was trying to blackmail his soon-to-be ex-wife. He wouldn't give the get, and he wanted her to give certain concessions. So what he did was he went and, without telling anybody who it was, married off his daughter. And he came back and said, I married off my daughter, but I'm not going to tell anybody whom she's married to. This means in practice, not only is his wife an aguna unable to get married, his daughter, who's a little kid, will not be able to get married either until she receives a get, but she doesn't know from whom she has to get the get. It was a terrible thing to do, but the reason I'm even raising this is to say that this has actually remained an issue. That's talk about exploitation on so many levels. But that was considered by all poskim across the board to be a terrible, terrible, wicked thing to do. One of the ways that people tried to get out of the situation was saying, this guy is obviously a wicked person. He's obviously a rasha. And because he is a wicked person by virtue of what he did, his testimony that his daughter is married perhaps isn't believable because we don't believe a wicked person. I'm not saying that worked. That's not really the point. The point is that it was universally condemned, even though the Torah says you're allowed to do this. So the fact that halacha allows it doesn't mean that it's a good thing at all. I think that's an important point to make. Among the biggest Rishayim in the world are people who abuse halacha for their own ends.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's not easy to come right out with that, but not everything that happened and not everything that is okay and that works is ethical. And this is another example of a conflict in that we can kind of conform our understanding of ethics to our modern world, which recognizes those power differentials, and be able to adapt and not use old-fashioned laws that were really originally meant to protect the underdog and use them to exploit.
Exactly. A law that made sense in one historical reality does not make it moral in a very different historical contingency. That's what I think I would say. And
right.
even
so
more,
I
it's not just that our morals have changed. I think it's also, as I said, that the idea of non-exploitation is embedded in these halachot implicitly and sometimes explicitly. Let's talk about the third principle, okay?
Honesty. Sexual health requires open and direct communication, and you have to be honest with yourself and with your sexual partner. And honesty with yourself involves, kind of being open to who you are sexually, open to sexual pleasure, sexual experiences, sexual education. If you can't be honest to yourself, then it's going to be hard to be honest with your partner. This is kind of based on recognizing that there is a diversity of sexual wants and needs and what people like. It's kind of like if you're a homosexual, but then you get married anyway. That would be being over on the principle of honesty. Mm-hmm. You would be transgressing that principle from a sexual health perspective, pretending to yourself and to your partner that you're not actually gay.
So to me, when I read about honesty, it seemed to me the biggest disconnect between what halacha and Torah Judaism, to put a broad term out there, say should happen and what actually happened. The biggest place where that disconnect happens might be in the realm of honesty. And I'm going to use a very specific example. Obviously, there are many different examples, but one example is exactly what we're doing today, which I referenced at the beginning of this podcast. The fact that we are openly talking about sex. Because if you look at what people learn in yeshivot, the fact that they learn Masechet Kiddushin, the fact they learn Masechet Ketuvot, Masechet Nida, the fact they learn Masechet Yevamot, the fact that on Yom Kippur at Mincha, when the entire Jewish people is in shul, the section that we read from the Torah is from Achremot about forbidden sexual relations. We do not shy away from talking about sex. We just don't. And the fact that halacha does not mind that kids in high school learn Gemara, Masechet Kiddushin, they learn, and clearly they're learning about sex there. We have to have open and honest conversations about sex. That letter you referenced earlier, there's a problem because the reality is that despite the fact that obviously sexual conversations are important and healthy and encouraged in practice, many, many Jews, young and old, have no idea what Jewish sexual values actually are beyond the fact they can only take place in marriage in the missionary position in a dark room. They don't know anything more than that. And this can lead to some terrible decision-making on everyone's part. It can lead to some terrible consequences for many different reasons. And halacha, I believe, is very very positive in terms of talking about these matters, being honest. There are many ways this is manifest. Now, someone might say to me, what about the fact that the Mishnah in Masechet Chagiga, in the second parak, says, Ein dorshin b'arayot b'shlosha. You can't talk about arayot, forbidden sexual relationships, with 3 people. And to me, as I've mentioned before, I think I mentioned it on our very first episode, to me it's clear that is not talking about sex the way we are right now, Talli. It's talking about a couple and their private sexual relationship and publicizing that, which is a violation of the norms of tzniut. It's a violation of honesty with each other. They have to be secure with each other, secure in the knowledge that what they're doing is private in order to be honest about their sexual wants and desires. When the Mishnah says, Ein dorshin b'arayot b'shlosha, you can't discuss these matters in front of 3 people, it means the person plus 3 more people. That's prohibited. What is allowed is for the person, the rabbi, or I think the modern equivalent, a marriage or sex counselor, cannot talk about it in front of 3, but he can talk about it in front of 2, the couple themselves and only the couple themselves. This means that a couple is allowed to discuss their intimate matters with somebody, a counselor, who is versed in these matters and who can help them. However, talking about it in front of that person and somebody else is completely unacceptable. Privacy is paramount. But that has nothing to do with talking about sex in the kind of discussions that we have here. So to me, honesty is very paramount. It's a big part of Jewish thought. It's a big part of Jewish values. And in practice, I think there's a disconnect because I think very often we don't see that. People are afraid to talk about it. One more idea when it comes to honesty, there also is a Jewish value that a couple having sex should not be thinking about other people. They should be thinking only about each other. And to me, that also is a manifestation of this value of honesty. What you're thinking about should be the other person. You shouldn't be going off and fantasizing about somebody else who's not part of that relationship at that moment of sexual contact between a husband and a wife. To me, that sounds like another manifestation of this intense personal honesty with a couple, that you're being really upfront and being at least trying on an ideal level to be really one with each other and with each other 100%. That to me is honesty.
I could take that, though, further, that being honest with yourself also means that if there's a sexual fantasy that is wired into your brain that is the only thing that works for you to reach sexual satisfaction, then you can be honest with yourself that that's how you're wired, and you don't have to be dishonest about pretending that you're able to follow this very difficult dictate of only thinking about something very specific during sex, and recognizing that we can't always be in complete control of our thoughts and our fantasies, nor according to the sexual health principles do we necessarily need to be. The other thing I want to say is I'm glad that you brought up the idea of sexual health conversations, the idea that we're doing this here. And we will continue to have sexual health conversations about sexual education, conversations about marital sex, but also conversations about sexuality that are not necessarily about married couples, according to the many different requests that we've had to talk about singles and to talk about gays and to talk about kink and to talk about all sorts of sexual experiences. And we will do that. We won't shy away from that. The other thing I want to say about honesty is that it also includes the way you talk to your kids about sex. In other words, if a kid asks you a question, then you don't cover it up or be shocked by it. You take a minute, you reflect, and you provide an answer which is appropriate to the age level of that child. So honesty is also about treating sexuality in an honest way. It's a subject that can be discussed. And again, you have every right to talk about it according to your system of values.
Okay, let's move on to the 4th principle.
The 4th principle has to do with values, shared values. I'll tell you something interesting that he says. It's kind of funny. So the day after a dolphin has sex, they don't spend the next day talking with their fellow dolphins about whether it was too soon, but humans do.
Right.
Children, teens, and adults of all ages think about their values and how they relate to experimenting with sexual activity, entering sexual relationships, or facing gender and sexual relationship diversity. This is really important because we are really about trying to integrate and also navigate the conflicts between what the ideal values are about sexuality, the idea of gender diversity and sexual orientation diversity. These are very complicated in our system of values, but we have to be able to recognize the conflict and not shy away from it and talk about it. Throughout the lifespan, sexual values are going to be important to talk about. I mean, we've done this. We've had podcasts on how do you navigate the family purity laws and how do you navigate around sex when you're, I don't know if we did this, we'd need to be doing episodes on pregnancy and postpartum and menopause and chronic illness and how all of these times in life can affect sexuality and what your values are, not just about the moral or the religious aspects of sex, but about sex itself. How important is sex in your marriage? How important are the values of connection and mutuality? So these are all part of what goes under the principle of shared values.
And I don't think that, at least from my understanding, Judaism would disagree with that at all. Obviously, these are conversations that husband and wife have to have. In a Jewish view, these values would largely be Jewish values. Obviously, it's not limited to that because there's also other elements which aren't Jewish per se. They're not non-Jewish, but what you want in a marriage, what you want in your sex relationship, what you do that is between you and your spouse. But on the other hand, the idea that a couple should have these shared values and should be on the same page is certainly something which I don't think I have to explain too much. That is a Jewish idea. Let's move on to the next one.
The fifth value is safety and protection. Sex should always have protection from unwanted pregnancy or from illness or disease. You have to be able to take the measures that need to be taken, and you should not ever have sex with somebody if you are going to expose them to illness, for example, or pregnancy that would be unwanted.
So here's an example, I think, where Judaism may indeed differ with this principle. I'd make a distinction between two different types of protection. Protection from an unwanted disease or any disease is certainly a value. Pikuach nefesh is important. Health is important. But protection against unwanted pregnancy is much more complicated. It's not nearly as simple as if you don't want to get pregnant, don't get pregnant. Obviously, on a personal level, as I never tire of saying, do whatever you want. But if you want to follow halakha, it's much more complicated. Halakha has a very nuanced and complicated view when it comes to birth control and preventing and stopping pregnancy. I don't know if this includes also abortion or if it's only talking about in the process of the Sex Act having birth control. But either way, halakha is not univocal, and halakha has many different opinions about this. And we're going to be doing an episode on birth control at some point soon. I do think it's important to note, though, that protection from an unwanted pregnancy is an absolute principle. Judaism would not agree with that. There are times when halakha would say that you are not allowed to use birth control. And people often don't want to hear that. And if they choose not to follow halakha on that, I don't mean this facetiously. That's their choice. And that's between them and God. And it's not for me to say whether that's the right or wrong decision. However, I'm not going to pretend the halakha says you can use birth control as much as you want because it's not true.
So I'm hearing what you're saying, but I would probably have to err on the side of human reproductive rights. I don't think that any woman should have to get pregnant against her will. I think it's just like rape, having a forced pregnancy. I'm sure that even if technically you're right, there's a lot of things that technically are halachic, but ethically are immoral, like we said before. And I think that this would be one of those examples. And
I think this moves back into the concept of shared values, where a couple probably should know what they want to do. Obviously, it can change, but a couple should probably make sure they're on the same page when it comes to pregnancy, or else these problems will most certainly arise at some point.
Right, but sometimes they don't always know. And, you know, you have like 4 kids and you're ready for your 5th, but you're not ready for your 5th. And you shouldn't have to have a 5th if you're not ready for it. And I don't think that there's any rabbi today that is going to say you have to have another kid, whether you want it or not. So even if he does have the technical halachic ground to stand on, there are other issues involved, including the exploitation of your body and your mental health, potentially. So there may be a conflict here, but I think that we all know what side would win out. I don't think that any kind of forced pregnancy can be considered a Jewish value.
I don't disagree with that. But what I mean by that is that once you bring in other issues and other values, such as non-exploitation and consent, well, that's a much more complicated situation. We're no longer just talking about protection in and of itself. I'm talking about, in isolation, this principle. Does Judaism say a person can prevent a pregnancy in all situations? The answer is no. Halacha does not say that. Now, does that mean it never does? Of course it sometimes does. But it's not as simple as this is an absolute right, and if a couple decides that without looking at any of the other principles, they simply don't want to ever have children, halacha would not look upon that positively. It would look at it negatively.
All right. That's fair. And I think that we'll talk more about it in at least one of the birth control episodes. I'm thinking that we're going to need two, actually. Okay. And finally, pleasure. Pleasure is a primary motivation for having sex. Women for sure have sexual organ that is designated just for the pleasure and doesn't have any other particular function. So we look at pleasure as one of the primary motivators. People like to have sex because it feels good, aside from the connection and the intimacy and just how nice it is to be making love. But I think that people do it partially because it has a lot of benefits of feeling good and releasing tension and releasing stress. So, the emphasis of pleasure as part of the sexual interaction, as part of the sexual experience, is an important value.
I agree that pleasure is a value and sexual pleasure is a Jewish value. I cited Masechet Nida, Daf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph, page 17a, on a recent podcast, which praised the household of Munbaz the king because they had sex in the daytime. And in explaining why that's a good thing, why is it not just neutral, the Gemara, as explained by Rashi, says, because in the daytime, husbands aren't overly tired, and therefore they can have sex for the sake of pleasure and not merely for the sake of obligation. It's a pretty amazing statement. Usually we think that doing something because of an obligation is the highest form of religiosity. Not so in this case, says the Gemara. When it comes to sex, pleasure is an important part of the sex act. But pleasure alone can't be the only value. And looking at pleasure as a value in and of itself without any boundaries, that could be a problem. Judaism does have boundaries to when pleasure is appropriate and in what context it's appropriate, because in preparing and looking at this principle, it said that we need to balance sexual pleasure with sexual safety. And I believe that halakha would say we have to balance three things: sexual pleasure, sexual safety, and the boundaries that Jewish law imposes. Those are significant boundaries. So, for example, when a couple is in nida, they can't have sex even if that would be pleasurable. Halacha says the relationship has to be heterosexual. Halacha says that it should be a couple and not masturbation. These are very, very difficult demands. But again, I'm not judging. I'm saying what halacha says is the demand. So within halacha, certainly pleasure is an important value, but we have to balance that important value with the boundaries it sets up, and that's how halacha looks at pleasure. That it's wonderful as long as it's done within very specific boundaries.
What I hear you saying is that pleasure is okay as long as, of course, you're married and you're heterosexual and it takes place at the right time. And I think that what we need to be able to do is go a little bit further than just say, look, halacha is halacha, and I'm not going to judge you. I think we have to have compassion for the very real conflict of people who don't have a way that's halachically valid to experience sexual pleasure, given that sexual pleasure is considered a human right. There are times where we might have to integrate our desire to be halachic with other aspects of our mental health and our sexual sides. And I think that part of our challenge, when your situation is ideal for you, you happen to be heterosexual cisgender and your partner is a heterosexual cisgender, that means not a transgender, you are privileged to be able to follow halacha in a fairly easy way. When you are not wired that way, you are going to be presented with challenges to your values as well as challenges to your mental health. And so we definitely need to talk about how we juggle the different parts of the physical self, physical health, spiritual health, mental health, and sexual health. The idea here is that if we do decide to not follow halacha, it should be done in a way that is intentional and mindful and not in a way of acting out, like what happens with people who tend to experience difficulties with their ability to control their sexual behavior. And, on that note, we mentioned the webinar that I'm going to be giving on Monday, and we will give the link to register. It's only $29.99 for an hour-long webinar on the treatment of problematic or out of control sexual behavior. One of the things I talk about is what's known as moral incongruence. That a person finds himself with certain sexual desires, sexual needs, and sexual drive. That's an identity. But then there's his spiritual identity, and those two things don't merge. They don't integrate. And so that results in kind of some spiritual and mental ill health when you're not able to integrate those sides. In fact, in talking about pornography addiction, in several studies, most men who self-report as pornography addicts are distressed because of their being religious. Religious men are far more likely to report a sexual addiction problem with objectively the same amount or less porn usage than men who are not religious and don't have a problem on any kind of values level with pornography. So what we know is that it's not so much the addiction to the pornography that is harmful, or even that it's an addiction at all, but that it's the inability to find congruence between your moral identity and your sexual identity. And I'll be talking more about that in the webinar.
When is the webinar taking place?
The webinar will be Monday, October 11th at 1:30 Eastern Standard Time and 8:30 p.m. Israel time.
I have no doubt that that webinar is going to be fantastic. If you would like to register, you can find a link in the description of this podcast and in the show notes. If you are listening to this podcast after October 11th, 2021, you can also find a link in the description and in the show notes for the recording, which is available as well. And again, let me just conclude by saying that my job is not to say what God thinks of anybody. I have absolutely no idea what God thinks of anybody. I'm just trying to tell you what it seems to me that halacha would say. And once again, what a person or a couple decides to do is between them and God. Rabbis do not go into the bedroom. I want to make that very, very clear.
At least not you.
Okay.
Hopefully not too many others.
I can tell you what halacha says, and beyond that, it genuinely is up to the person in his or her relationship with God and with his or her spouse or partner. That's all for today, Talli. This is a very interesting episode. Thank you for presenting that. I learned a lot. I hope our listeners did as well. Make sure you check out our Patreon site. Patreon is a great chance for you to get bonus material, episodes, merch, and more, while also helping us with our mission of Intimate Judaism. You can find the link in the description of this podcast. Remember to continue to write to us, intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Visit jewishcoffeehouse.com, tallirosenbaum.com, and intimatejudaism.com. Thanks for listening.
Thanks. Bye.